thank you all for coming back and being with us today. So I've been looking forward to this for a while. We finally got you pinned down, Byron. So everybody remember the Johnny Cash song, I've Been Everywhere? You know, Johnny's got nothing on this guy. I think Byron's logged more miles than just about anybody I know, and it's tough to get him scheduled. And so, Byron, thanks for being here with us today. Byron is a walking encyclopedia of information. When I first met him 9 or 10 years ago, I almost quit because I was so blown away by his knowledge. I thought I would never be able to have that kind of information. And so Byron's been a good friend to me. I've really looked up to him. I appreciate his work. And again, his willingness to be here with us this evening. So I'd like to share a little bit of introduction about Byron and his credentials before we start. So first of all, Byron has a PhD from Northwestern University. He also is a retired lieutenant colonel as well. He's a senior subject matter expert to DTRA's Research and Development Directorate in the areas of nuclear and conventional weapons effects and testing, hard and deeply buried target characterization and defeat, counterterrorism, cooperative threat reduction, knowledge preservation, nuclear test readiness, and to the Defense Threat Reduction Information Analysis Center, which those of us up here lovingly refer to as DTRIAC. Prior to the underground nuclear testing moratorium in 1992, he was the UGT containment scientist for the Defense Nuclear Agency. Due to his experience, he is an advisor to the U.S. intelligence community on nuclear programs. Since 1994, he has had a key role in DoD's cooperative threat reduction efforts with the Russian Federation Nuclear Laboratories and the Kazakhstan National Nuclear Center. Currently, he is the technical lead for nuclear remediation activities at Degelen Mountain and other areas at the former Soviet Semipalatinsk test site in Kazakhstan. Moving on to the end of this, I had to skip over some. He's got a lot of credentials, if I didn't say. He is the recipient of the Defense Special Weapons Agency's and DTRA's Exceptional Service Medals, the Russian Federation Kurchatov Medal, the Kazakhstan Exceptional Atomic Worker Medal, and several other military and civilian awards during his 40 years of service to the nation. So he has been called garrulous. He's even been called hunch. He is my friend, Byron Ristvet. Let's welcome Byron.
And
on here.
if I could just ask everyone to hold your questions to the very end so that we can get those recorded on our video recording as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ellen. That's a very nice introduction. What Alan was referring to as garrulous, there's a recent publication that came out 2 weeks ago from the Kennedy School of Government that tells all about Degelen Mountain. That's how you say it, Alan. And it describes the work that we've done over there in ensuring that a lot of plutonium, weapons-grade plutonium that was left behind by the Russians is not proliferable. And we're talking several hundred kilograms of material. And incidentally, their plutonium is a little better than ours. So it's for building bombs. Anyway, it's been fun working side by side with the Russians. Very interesting to be able to exchange classified information with your former enemies, and at the same time make the world safer. So anyway, I'm going to talk very quickly about U.S. nuclear weapons testing during the Cold War. Now, many of you don't know what the Defense Threat Reduction Agency is. When I joined, it was the Defense Nuclear Agency, and that was when nuke was our middle name. And before that, it was the Defense Atomic Support Agency, and before that, a thing called the Armed Forces Special Weapons Project, which was founded the same day as the Atomic Energy Commission by General Groves. And so it was the DoD equivalent to the Atomic Energy Commission, because while Groves was a strong supporter of civilian control of nuclear energy, General Groves also felt that he couldn't trust the Army and the Navy. So we were actually a Department of Defense organization prior to the Department of Defense. because we stood up on 1 January 1947, and DOD didn't stand up until November 11th, 1947. So we're celebrating 66 years of being in existence. Okay, I'm going to try and emphasize all the great contributions Los Alamos made over the years, and why we actually got into the testing business and the nuclear weapons business. I know I said in the synopsis a little bit about target to stockpile sequence, and I'll save that for questions at the end if anybody's interested. You're probably noticing the button Glenn McDuff gave me here. And if you notice a little red there, that's the contributions of Livermore in the nuclear weapons program. And the blue is the contributions of the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory. Okay? So let's get into this. Okay. Why do we have nuclear weapons anyway? I guess I can read it here. First off, in 1943, there was a lot of evidence that we weren't going to win the war. And nuclear weapons, nuclear energy weapons, were seen as the only way to victory. Then things changed. And of course, this is exactly what the Japanese predicted, who had been over in the United States, that the tremendous manufacturing capability and the will of the people would defeat them. But winning in Europe was pretty likely. And by 44, 45, winning in Japan was going to happen, but it looked torturous and very bloody. And here I think is what it says. So what role did we envision for these first two atomic bombs? Slaughter in the Pacific grew day by day, and I mean day by day. Think about this. 2/3 of all the deaths in the Pacific occurred in the last 10 months of the war. Okay? We had bombed all the major cities, firebombed the major cities in Japan, and killed over 400,000 people without any indication of surrender. So the new goal was stop the war before the invasion of Japan, which by good estimates probably would have resulted in 8 to 12 million lives. Okay? That's the civilians in Japan and probably 1 million casualties just in the United States. Now let's get into the testing. Why did we test? Well, it was for weapons development. Build new weapons. Safety has always been a big issue in the U.S. inventory. Physics phenomenology, that's to avoid technological surprises. Also stockpile confidence. Now we really didn't do very many stockpile confidence tests, and the reason being, everybody got real nervous when you went to do one. What happens if it doesn't go off? What happens if it doesn't perform right? And it wasn't the lab guys who were so nervous, it was the DOD guys, okay? And then we, for weapons effects, on military systems, are they going to survive? Are they going to be able to perform the deterrent role that we have them? And incidentally, in the weapons effects, we had a lot of built-in transparency into the program. We deliberately let the Russians and others from their satellites see what we were doing. And why? They know you tested it. They got to assume that it's going to work through the nuclear battlefield. And what better way to have deterrence than to say, hey, I've got these, multi-kiloton weapons that I know will work. They will travel through space and they will get to target. And then you also worry about people and infrastructure. I think today more about infrastructure. It's amazing, we just had an EMP commission write a long report. I was one of the panel, not on the panel, but one of the guys who testified many times in front of them. And it's just being ignored. But we'll move on. Okay, this is all the types of tests that we did in the United States by type. As you can see, the vast majority were for weapons development. This is the development of new weapons. On average, 8 to 10 tests for every new physics package that went into a weapons system. There were about 100 that were dedicated to weapons effects, 88 safety experiments, 35 peaceful nuclear explosions. Incidentally, the Russians did 129. 7 were related to seismic detection. the Vela uniform program. 8 are kind of like safety. They're storage and transportation, how you're going to clean up after one. And then we did 24 for the Brits, because after the moratorium, the British did not want to return to Australia and try to do underground nuclear testing at Maralinga. There was a lot of, as you know, the British Empire was starting to fall apart at that time. And so we agreed to do them, and so they used to alternate between, you know, the lab and the other lab. So, yeah, I have a lot of love for Los Alamos, I really do. Anyway, here's a quick summary of the U.S. testing. We did 210 atmospheric tests. We did 5 underwater tests, including 2 just 500 miles off of San Diego. I don't know if a lot of people know that. We did 2 again out at Anahuac, 1 at Bikini. And then we did underground tests, mostly at the Nevada test site, but we also did 3 in Alaska, 2 in Colorado, 2 of them here in New Mexico, 2 down in Mississippi at Hattiesburg, and every time there's a 2-headed chicken that's born down there, we hear about it. They were Vela uniform shots. And a couple out in Nevada. And again, you can read the numbers up there by type. We did it every way you can think of: airdrops, balloons, barges, rockets, surface, tower shots, the underwater tests. We also did them in tunnels, mostly in vertical shafts, and we did a few that were specifically for making craters. Here's where they were all done. And probably one of the striking things to see is this one down here in the South Atlantic called Argus. And Argus was a very interesting shot. It was an extremely top secret program at the time when it was conducted. And we fired off 3 low yield, around 2 kiloton weapons up at altitudes exceeding 300 miles. And what were we going to do? We were going to inject beta particles, electrons, into the Van Allen radiation belt. And that was going to form a ballistic missile shield over the Earth. Problem is, George Christophilus at Livermore only made about 3 orders of magnitude error in his calculations. You can't get that many electrons into the Van Allen belt. But pretty gutsy to fire a rocket with a nuclear warhead off a ship, okay, 3 times. And that point happens to be the magnetic conjugate point of the Earth, okay? So that's why they wanted to inject them there. We did them all in the U.S. Again, up at Nevada test site, 5 on the Nellis Range, which were all transportation, storage, safety type tests. Of course, the one down Trinity, it says Alamogordo. It's really closer to Socorro, but that's okay. And then 2 underwater shots off of San Diego. I'll talk about those. Here's the various ways we tested. Okay, we did them on top of towers. And you can see typical 500 up to 700 foot high towers. Used to be a test of manhood. I didn't have to do it. In the old test days, for a guy to climb up a 500 foot tower. And I'm told I've done it up a 200-foot tower, and you know, when you get about 100 feet above the ground, you have to push yourself away from the ladder, because now the rungs are embedded in your chest. Okay? And then when you get to the top, there's just a little bitty gap, and it seems like it's about a yard wide, you know, and when you crawl up on the platform. Out in the Pacific, we did them on barges. We did them out in Nevada. You love that test stand? Is that a nice one? A small boy. We did them off of balloons. We did them in water tanks. We did them underwater. That's a 2,400 foot high spray dome. Okay? We did them airdrops, another airdrop there. And this is an interesting test. That was Stokes, 19 kilotons. The Navy was going to use blimps, okay, in the late 50s for anti-submarine warfare. And they were going to equip them with nuclear depth charges. And somebody said, Well, when the shock wave hits the blimp, it's going to bring the blimp down. And so this was really an admiral's test to show the admirals that that would happen. Because, see, the sound speed through helium is twice as fast as it is through air. So the shock wave goes racing through the balloon. There's nothing to confine it on the outside, and it just shoots out the other end and rips the canopy. Anyway, the early shot cabs sort of look like this. Very complex. Believe it or not, the gadget's in there. And that's just an aluminum can to make it look like a generator. And that was just for security. So a lot of our shots all the way through the 51 series Buster Jangle were in these aluminum cans for a security feature. There's actually a round bomb in that one. So just so you know. That shouldn't be in there. First test we did was down at Trinity. And there's Norris Bradbury standing next to the gadget up there on top of the 100-foot high tower. 5,300 pounds of explosives, gave about 18.5 kilotons. And this was, to test the implosion system of the Fat Man. Is it really going to work? Even though they had done lots and lots of testing out at S-Site with the implosion systems, there was still debate whether it would really work. And in fact, most people thought the yield would only be 5 kilotons. But incidentally, they did the safety planning for 50. So it wasn't bad. In fact, if you see over on the side there, and if you go down to one of the Trinity tours, you can still see the remains of the jumbo. They were going to put the bomb off in there because they didn't have enough plutonium to make another bomb at the time. So if it did fizzle, they were going to catch the plutonium. And then Hans Bethe, he calculated, 5,300 pounds of HE, you've got quite a hand grenade there. It'll just rip the walls apart on the jumbo. So they abandoned that idea. Okay. And there's just some quick pictures of Trinity. You've got Oppenheimer and Groves over there on the side. The crater, which you have Rob Hermes here as an expert on the Trinitite, and the high-speed cameras. Photos, those are 1,000 frame a second. They were taken by, for those who know Benjamin C. Benjamin, they were taken from the West 10,000 station. And then, of course, we had to go out and show the Navy what could be done, so we did 2 shots out in the Pacific. These were Fat Man type implosion devices, a nominal 21 kilotons for each one. One was an airdrop, and recently passed away Leon Smith was a weaponeer on that shot. And of course, as normal, the Air Force could never hit anything they aimed at. This was still the Army Air Corps. And the bomb sort of missed by about 2,400 feet and went off, instead of over the USS Nevada, over the USS Gillem, which had all the cameras on it. So the only pictures you ever see of Able are these long distance pictures, which incidentally were taken by the Army Air Corps. And that's why when they were doing the planning for Sandstone, that mission was turned over to the brand new United States Air Force, and a little place called Lookout Mountain Photographic Laboratory was created. And if you ever get a chance, there's a video out by Peter Coran called The Atomic Cinematographers, and it's really great. Okay, now we're getting into Cold War. I don't know why 47 starts the Cold War, but it does. I guess it had to do with the Berlin airlift and all that stuff. Anyway, we did shot out in the Pacific. We did 3 of them, 3 development tests: Sandstone, X-ray, Yoke, and Zebra, and you can read the yields there. And this is out at Eniwetok, 2,500 more miles west of the 2,500 miles it takes to get to Honolulu, or 3,100 from here. And there was actually some effects stuff on it. They had a bunch of experiments down here. This is kind of interesting. They put asphalt down there to keep the dust from being in the way of being uplifted, so they could get better photography. except they forgot that at the speed of light, a thermal pulse comes out. And at that distance, that thermal pulse is about, that's a 300-foot tower, is about 80 calories per square centimeter. Now, that doesn't mean much to you. You get a first-degree burn at 3 calories per square centimeter, second-degree burn at 5, and a third-degree burn at about 7 or 8. Okay? Well, it liquefies the asphalt. And then the air blast comes and picks it up and blows it into all the air blast gauges. Incidentally, Sir William Penny told him that was going to happen, but nobody listened to him. So anyway, Bill Penny was a really bright guy from AWE. 49, we no longer were exclusive. Joined in the first Soviet test and was conducted in Kazakhstan at the Semipalatinus test site, 29 August 1949. That's a picture of the designer there, he and Kurchatov, that's Karatran, and Yuri Karatran. He only died about 6 or 7 years ago, in his upper 80s. And when you take the tour of the museum at Sarov, they like to point at their first bomb and say, our first bomb looks just like your first bomb. And that's true, right down to the paint. Okay? So Klaus Fuchs did a great job. Anyway, not for us, but for Beria. Anyway, the Russians did most of their early testing at Semipalatinus here in Kazakhstan. And then later on in 55, they moved up here to the northern site called Novaya Zemlya. And they currently still maintain this as a readiness site for underground testing. And it's a really great place. That's 73 degrees north. 200 days of the year, the high is below freezing. Okay? They don't have a huge security force up there because they have these other guards that wear these white fur coats called polar bears. In fact, they don't let you go out without being armed. Okay, so anyway, but they think it's wonderful up there. So for the U.S., we had originally out in the Pacific Proving Grounds. We were out at Eniwetok and Bikini, started at Bikini, but you couldn't build a long airstrip at Bikini. So they moved to Eniwetok. And we found out something about Marshall Islanders, which we didn't know at the time. We thought they were very willing to give us their land to do this work because, we had freed them from the Japanese and this and that. Actuality, when the Japanese ran plantations there, they loved it. Now, in Marshallese culture, you can't say no if it's something you can do for somebody when he asks you. So we asked them to leave their atolls. They didn't want to, but they couldn't say no. Okay? Anyway, problem with the Pacific Proving Ground was it was a long ways away, and we didn't have jet airplanes then. And at the same time, there were security issues. Comes around 1950, we start a war in Korea, takes a lot of the Navy assets. We were afraid that the Soviets would come and land on Eniwetok and steal a bomb. Okay? So Truman finally agreed to establish a continental site because he was very opposed to it. He wanted to maintain a mystique that testing these weapons was so dangerous you couldn't do it within your continental borders. Okay, so he was opposed to that. Oppenheimer was opposed to it. Edward Teller, fortunately, wasn't. But so it got pushed, and it was really the Korean War that convinced Truman to go ahead and do it. And he said, okay, you're not going to do them over 40 kilotons originally. And it got raised to 50. Biggest we did out there was 74. That was the hood shot. And so he started off doing them sort of as you'll see here in a minute at the same time. Incidentally, the original test site was only 680 square miles. It got expanded in all those years listed up there. And today it's about 1,375 square miles, but it's surrounded by another 5,700 square miles roughly of controlled federal land. So it's a 4,700. So it's a very large area. But what's interesting is when you go to the semi-Palatinus test site, it's as large as all of that. It's 5.5 times larger than the Nevada test site. And it doesn't have good roads, I can assure you. And for those who have been there, they can testify that. I know Glenn can. So what did we do out at the Nevada test site? Well, Truman approved building the Nevada Proving Ground on December 18th, 1950. And by January 27, 1951, we were out doing the first test called Able. And let me tell you, I can't go into the details at all, but Able was a real test. It was only a kiloton, but it was about a 50-50 chance it wouldn't work. Okay? And so I think that's pretty gutsy. You know, you think you go out to a brand new test site and do something. And Al Graves said, we're not wasting, you know, our resources. We're going to make it a real test. And so it was. And then they did Baker, Charlie, Baker 2, and Fox. And Baker 2 didn't work. Baker 1 didn't work very well, and Baker 2 didn't work equally as well. So, but the last two, Baker and Fox, Baker 2, the clouds actually went south. We don't tell this much to the people of Las Vegas, but it did. And believe it or not, where we decontaminated the cloud sampling airplanes at Nellis, we're now being asked to relook at all that again, to clean it up more. Somebody must have found, you know, an atom of cesium. So anyway, then out in the Pacific again. This program almost got canceled, and because of the concern about security. And if it hadn't been for this big test called George, which had the Silex experiment on it, which is the first time we had a deuterium-tritium burn. Okay, very important in weapons development. It showed that by using radiative compression, you could cause a thermonuclear burn. Okay, you could cause fusion to occur. And wasn't very much, but it was enough to say, we can proceed ahead. We also had another interesting shot at that time, and it was called ITEM. And ITEM was the first test of boosting. Okay. Same year, go back to Nevada, okay? And people now realize that this was not good to be doing two places at once, but they hadn't changed yet. You had the Buster and Jangle series. There were two names, Buster for the development shots and Jangle for the DOD shots, the effects tests. And you can see the number of them. The big thing that came out of this, now incidentally, this was all Los Alamos. You know, Livermore was still just a gleam in Edward Tiller's eye. You know, it hadn't occurred yet. That's why there's just a little red here, okay? Anyway, I think one of the biggest things came out of the easy test at 31 kilotons was an 1,800-pound mass gravity bomb that could be carried externally on fighter aircraft. Okay? And that had a rather novel safety features on it and things like that, all developed here at Los Alamos. So it was a very important test for the Department of Defense, especially for the inevitable battle we were going to fight in Europe with the Soviets having 5-to-1 tank advantage and all this and that. And if even back in the late 50s, if you look at the old war plans, the emergency action plans, you know, you tried to hold them off for about 3 days and then you were going to go to nukes. So you wanted fighter aircraft deliverable nukes. Okay? So that's what they did. And then we did 2 effects tests. And they were related to earth-penetrating weapons. Should we build earth-penetrating weapons? Problem is, they tested them against above-ground structures. Nobody was thinking of underground structures. That's okay. And lots of Army participation. I should say DOD participation, mostly Army, in what was called Operation Desert Rock. There were 9 of them. Basically, you have about 6,500 troops on each one, and they would sit there and observe it, and usually be seated. If they were seated, they would be about at the half PSI level, about 30,000 feet away from the shot. If they were in trenches, they'd put them about 20,000 feet away, or 2 PSI, and the air blast kind of go over the top of them, shower them good with rocks. The officers got to wear goggles. The enlisted swine had to cover their eyes with their hands and see the bones in their hands. And that was looking away from the shot, okay, just from the reflection off the ground. And then they'd march into 5R, okay? This was to orient themselves in the nuclear battlefield. There they are in the trenches. This is Tumbler Snapper, June of '52. 6 developmental tests, and then 2 effects tests. Again, what we were doing here was working our way towards designs for, the thermonuclear experiment that was going to come up in Ivy Mike, but we were also trying to make them smaller and lighter and get more yield. So a lot of important stuff. Again, this is all Los Alamos. And then you go out to Operation Ivy, and you had 2 tests. Mike, which was the first true thermonuclear fusion device, worked fine. Predicted to go at 10 megatons, went at 10.4. It's not bad. And then, but had a little problem. It was liquid deuterium tritium. So it weighed 82 tons. And B-29s couldn't carry that. So to make sure we had a high yield device, we tested another thing called King, which was all fission, okay, and it got 500 kilotons. Now you can get a little more than that, but not much more, because you just can't hold that mass of fissionable material together long enough, and you learn that through testing, okay, to get much more yield than 500. So this went into the stockpile for about a year, and it was our emergency, about 2 years, I'm sorry. That was sort of an emergency backup thing, and that device wasn't exactly safe, okay? As Glenn can tell you, the only way they made it safe was by putting 140 feet of aluminum chain inside the device, so it wouldn't come together in an accident. There's a view of why Ivy Mike weighed so much. You had all this cryogenic stuff. There's a man for scale there. These are Teller light experiments out here. Going out the back way is this long helium-filled box known as the Ogle-Krause box. Didn't work. It was full of helium. You just got too much scattering of the radiation to make good measurements out of it. But again, you learn that through testing. But at the same time, it gave the lab a lot of, push with the vacuum companies to make better vacuum pumps. So they could have evacuated LOS pipes. And so by the time we got to the next series, it's not this one, out in the Pacific, the Castle series, we did vacuum LOS pipe diagnostics. And so we found out that the Teller light ones worked just about as well, and so that allowed us to do barge testing, which you'll see in a second. Upshot knothole, okay? We had 11 tests out there. We had the first Livermore test, Ruth, Ray, Simon, and then we had some effects tests. Ruth and Ray were total failures. Okay, Livermore's first 2. You gotta remember, Livermore started off with a great track record. 3 out of 4 of their tests, okay, were failures. And I'll tell you, it came very close to doing away with Livermore. Okay, it was like, if these guys can't make one go off, why should Congress be funding another laboratory? So when they got to the 55 series, they made sure they worked. But you know, giving credit to Livermore, they were looking at unusual designs, okay? Teller said we're not going to design them like Los Alamos. And but Los Alamos used conservative design. They didn't. There's some Los Alamos people who were at Upshot Knothole. You got Bill Ogle over there, and Dahl, and Corsby, Mr. Fallout, and then Al Graves, who was the test director. There's a couple of the shots. There's one that worked very well for Los Alamos. It was the Climax event, which was 61 KT. And then the first one by Livermore, 300-foot tower, 200 tons, did not work well at all. And in fact, Ogle is said to have gone up to Teller and said to Edward, he said, you know, Edward, if you're done with that tower, we could probably use it. Operation Castle, this is where we get real thermonuclear devices, ones that became deliverable. That's the Bravo device up there, 15 megatons, a little bit higher yield than expected. Didn't understand some of the lithium deuterium interactions, but it was a 23,000 pound bomb. It was certainly carryable in a B-36. Pushes the limit even of a B-50, but it could go to B-36. And the 36 was coming online at the same time. Then the Livermore shot, the Coon, had a yield of 110 kilotons, was expected to be 1 to 2 megatons. This was the third one. And if you ask in the questions, I'll tell you my favorite Edward Teller story. Anyway, interesting thing is they had a lot of vacuum pipes and Teller light experiments and all that on it. Then they moved to barges, and why? Reduce fallout. Okay, but they'd put ballast in the barge, okay, sand, and sometimes Nevada soil. They would ship Nevada soil out to Anahuac to put in the barges so that the backgrounds for the radiochemists would be the same, okay? And yeah, because if you didn't have the sand in there, you didn't get enough fallout for the radiochemists. Teapot, 55, out at Nevada. You've seen all these nice little pictures. This happened to be Apple II. Yes, there was an Apple I. This was a Los Alamos gadget. Apple I didn't work the way it was supposed to, so there was an Apple II test. And of course, it had a whole variety of federal civil defense structures on it and some military structures and things. 500-foot tower, 29 kilotons. Then we go back to the Pacific. Next year, 56, 17 tests at Anahuac, Bikini, trying to make smaller and lighter thermonuclear weapons, trying to design warheads, thermonuclear devices that will go into warheads on missiles. We're already thinking about missiles now. And also clean weapons, okay? We weren't going to have these dirty, you know, metal burning fission weapons anymore. We were going to have these nice clean weapons that just gave off lots of neutrons and gammas. So this was more humane. Somehow I just don't quite fathom that, but that was what was being considered. Cherokee is kind of interesting. It was the first airdrop of a thermonuclear device by a B-52. It's the one that sits at the museum down in Albuquerque, the same airplane. And 3.8 megatons. Only slight problem there. When they made 3 perfect bomb runs over the island where they did Bravo at, on the other end of Nam, and everything looked perfect. They come to do the last one, they dropped it 22,500 feet off a target. And it just totally negated everything. Instrumentation, we had lots of structures built out there for effects and everything else. Guy put the windage in backwards. I always loved this. This is lacrosse. For those who know Bob Brownlee, this was Bob Brownlee's test. And it was a very interesting experiment. Had 40 lines of pipe, vacuum line of sight pipes on it for measuring the radiation that they wanted to measure and the phenomena, and cost $40 million. Most expensive shot. That one shot was almost equal to the cost of all the others that were done in Red Wing. The other 16, I think it is. Plumb Bob, come back to Nevada test site, do 25 atmospheric tests, and notice 4 underground tests. So underground testing came about because of Willard Libby, who was later chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission. He was a medical physician in addition to a health physicist. And he actually was concerned about fallout when he started noticing cesium-137 in the bones of children in Amarillo following Trinity. And he said, gee, if we keep building this up, it's going to affect the marrow, and these kids are going to have leukemia 30 years later. Okay, talk about a man with vision. Anyway, all sorts of tests. This one picture up here is one of the first released Rapatronic photos. That's 1 microsecond in duration. That's probably, I'm going to guess, about 4 or 5 microseconds into the detonation. And you can see the shock front. They're certainly never symmetric. And all these little spears coming down, those are the cables, the guy cables to the balloon. And basically, they heat up and heat the air around it, kind of create a vacuum so it flows faster down that way. All this interesting stuff you learn by testing. Down at the bottom was the Genie test, the John test, which was the Genie rocket, about 2 kilotons. This was a air-to-air rocket. There it is again. Get to hardtack 1. Notice now we're up to 34 tests, 28 weapons development, 1 safety shot, 2 underwater, and 3 high altitude shots. Okay, 2 were rockets at Johnson Atoll. And we also in 58 did this Project Argus to look at these 3 events, create this ballistic missile shield over the Earth. We also did these high altitude ones over Johnson Atoll, Teak and Orange, both 3.8 megatons, one at 77 kilometers and one at 43 kilometers. The Orange event in particular took out all the telephone system on Oahu, okay? And in addition to taking out a lot of the power grid too. This is where we learned about a thing called high altitude EMP. And the reason the fireballs, incidentally, just to give you an idea, that's almost 100 kilometers across, okay? That's because X-rays travel forever in space. They go 4 meters in air, okay? Max. So there's nothing to stop them in space. So you see that luminous front expand out at basically the speed of light. Came back to Nevada, did 24 atmospheric tests, 13 underground tests. What's interesting is 18 total safety tests in that. Safety was becoming a huge concern. And what I also found interesting, we knew the moratorium was coming. Do you think people were rushed to do 4 events in 1 day, twice? And they would have done 5 on the last day before the moratorium. Okay, but they couldn't get the gadget ready in time. So, and about an equal number of Livermore and Los Alamos in these later ones. Test moratorium, Eisenhower declared it, and it was going to begin on 31st of October. A huge debate over what midnight to use on the 31st of October, okay? Is it Washington time? Is it Nevada time? Is it Hawaii time? Is it Guam time? If they'd used Guam time, they would have gotten that 5th one off, okay? So, anyway, can't make these stories up, I'll tell you, they're true. Of course, and 1st of September, with 1 day's notice to the U.S., Soviets conducted 59 tests in 3 months, okay? Including one at 50 megatons. the Tsar we we had 8 underground test sites almost ready for testing, and we got a couple of underground ones off pretty quickly. But as McNamara called them, these were just nuclear firecrackers, nuclear burps. They were nothing. He wanted to shake the ground. He wanted to demonstrate that we could do this. So finally, Kennedy approved atmospheric testing on 30 November. Because incidentally, all the other tests we were doing were mostly safety related and had no yield, or very little yield. We went out to the Pacific. We did some airdrops, 24 of them. And there's one, I'm sorry that's a Livermore shot. I always love it because it's one of the prettier ones. And, you know, we did 2 operational stockpile confidence tests, one called Frigate Bird, one called Swordfish. Frigate Bird was actual launch of a Polaris off of the USS Ethan Allen near Christmas Island. Did a 1,000 nautical mile flight and went off at 2,100 feet above the ocean and performed just exactly like it was supposed to. And then Swordfish was the ASROC. Okay, for those who worked on that was a Los Alamos gadget. Frigate Bird was a Livermore gadget. And you know, that's really gutsy because the ASROC had a habit sometimes of turning around and coming right back at the ship that launched it. So that's why the ASROC warhead had an extra detonator in it. Okay. So, anyway, then we did all these high altitude shots to resolve all the problems and all the questions we had learned back in '58 or had questions about. I think it just created more misunderstanding of high altitude phenomena than it helped. But because we're still studying this high altitude data today, and so are our Soviet or Russian friends. Don't really understand high altitude phenomena very well. Anyway, again, when we did Starfish, we just took out all of the power on Oahu and Kauai. Okay. And we had a couple of little accidents out there at Johnson Atoll. One was, Bluegill Prime, blew up on the launch pad. The missile did, and unfortunately so did the warhead. It just went, you know, it was 1 point safe, but it scattered a lot of plutonium on the island. And took us many years to clean it up. We came back here to the Nevada test site, and guess what? We did 4 shots out there. They were all fixed tests, from Little Feller to Small Boy here. This was a source region EMP test. And then the last U.S. airdropped atmospheric test was still going on in the Pacific. Incidentally, Kennedy got a little upset with this. We got the Cuban Missile Crisis going on while this was happening. We're out there testing. We're out there firing rockets at Johnson Atoll. And this one was 8.3 megatons of a Livermore shot. And what's interesting is it created a small tsunami on the Big Island of Hawaii. Well, then we go into a test ban treaty. We're still allowed to do peaceful nuclear explosions. There's Sedan going off, 104 kilotons, buried 635 feet. Makes a very large hole. This is our #1 tourist attraction at the Nevada test site. And you know, so it's fun to go see. And we had to go underground. And I'll really go through these quick. Basically, we had to do things. I think this will run by itself. Probably have to go over here and hit it though. What do we got to hit? There. They're running?
Go back where you were and then look for the little arrow down the bottom.
Take your little mouse down to the arrow and click.
I got it. If you've never seen one go off underground, this is what happens. That was a shock wave going out, rarefaction wave coming back in, and then you wait a while, a few hours, and it collapses if it's buried shallow enough. Now, it looks real nice when it's going down. You don't want to be there when it's happening. So. But anyway, we did them all over the U.S. Some of those were for Vila uniform. Some of them were plowshare. The ones in Farmington, Grand Valley, and Rifle were all related to plowshare programs for gas stimulation in the Mesa Verde Formation. First attempts to go underground were in '57, and this is just what happened that year. Pascal A was the Los Alamos first test. It was supposed to be a 1-point safety test. It was done about 2 o'clock in the morning. They got it all set up and ready to go, and they said we might as well shoot it. It wasn't exactly safe. And it's described as one of the more awesome Roman candles that anybody had ever seen. Then came back and did Pascal B in August, and that was also in a 36-inch hole. No stemming except for a 3-foot concrete plug down about midway in the hole, and it had a lid on top of it, 3-inch thick steel plate welded to the top of the drill casing. And it had a slight yield. Okay? The plate came off that, and Al Graves asked Bob Brownlee how fast the plate was going. And Bob Brownlee said very fast, and Graves said, I want to know how fast it was going. Well, Graves, for any of those who worked with Al Graves, I'm told his fuse was about yay long and it was always burning. And so Al said, Brownlee, I asked you a question. And Brownlee realized he was probably about yay from being fired. So first thing that came to Bob's mind is it was six times escape. And Al said, 6 times escape? Nobody, but an astrophysicist is thinking about escape velocities of the Earth. Okay? That's August. Sputnik wasn't until October. Brownlee still gets emails, are you the man that put a manhole cover in space? Okay? Incidentally, they had a camera on it to watch it, and it caught it just barely in 1 frame of 1,000 frame a second camera. Okay? So it was moving. Instead, they've never found the manhole cover. Livermore did tests, and the Rainier test was actually designed to be contained. Anyway, the limited test ban treaty had a huge impact on testing, and it said we could still test underground, but the Russians had a little bit different meaning in their copy of the treaty. When it was translated into Russian, it said debris, radioactive debris, could not cross the international borders. They meant that to mean solid material. For us, we meant it to be any radioactive material, gaseous, liquid, solid. Okay, so we operated on not 1 atom out. And for the Russians, it was safe to conduct a test if it would release no more than 1 million curies. Okay, that is a huge amount of radiation. All right, and in actuality, they released a lot more than 1 million, so a lot of time. And what it did for us, it just made underground tests much more expensive. Okay, because containment dictated. And like Tom Kunkel sitting over there, we're both, as the engineers used to call us and the operations folks, containment pukes. So, this is the history. We had 158 underground tests that had some atoms out. 39 were Los Alamos, and 119 were Brand X. So, and 2 were post-Bainbury. And why do we talk about post-Bainbury? Because this is what changed containment. Okay, for those who were around in 1970, just before I started to work in this area, but it was a prompt mass event, and it led to revision in containment designs, and it led to the establishment of the Containment Evaluation Panel, who had virtual veto authority on a test. And so did the containment scientists, in a sense. That's why the ops people didn't like us. And plus, we containment guys was kind of fun. We had to know everything going on the test. We often knew more than the test director, because we'd go out and talk with the people, the diagnosticians, whatever, and find out about all that stuff. At least I did. And I did it on the lab tests, not let alone the DNA tests. I want to just show you one, and this is where we got to go to the other thing, and then I'm going to kind of quit. I'm not through with this briefing, but we're getting there at that time. And I know you'd like to ask some questions. I want to show you what happens when you don't design one right. Go ahead. There's no sound on this. Okay, this is a shot called Des Moines, 2.9 kilotons, Livermore shot. That was a gas sampling pipe. That was a millisecond. 1,000th of a second to get up there. There were two men down here, Dick MacArthur and, oh, God, having a senior moment here. It'll hit me the other guy's name. And they promptly left. They were also supposed to retrieve a lead pig that had some gold foils and other foils for neutron measurements. And then it's coming out of a vent hole. Now it's coming out the portal. Now what's amazing is down the tunnel, around a bend, a 90-degree bend with a 5-ton steel door. That 5-ton steel door comes out there, goes a quarter of a mile across the canyon, and never dropped a foot in trajectory. But this was only 2.9 kilotons. This is the power of these things. Here in a second, you're going to see a close-up. And the flow is subsonic, then it goes supersonic, right there. And if the clip is long enough, you'll start seeing some of the big boulders come down the hill here from the ground shock that have been dislodged up in the welded tuff above. There they come. That's about the size of a Volkswagen. That's why we used to build massive steel things over some of the stuff down at the portals that we wanted to make sure survived. Anyway, we have to get out of that? Okay. So looking at those things that we one time proposed, putting a nuke on either what's called the JASM, the Joint Atomic Standoff Missile, Joint Attack Standoff Missile, or on the ALCM, or ACM, the Advanced Cruise Missile, and flying it down tunnels of some of our adversaries' command and control facilities. I guarantee you, blast doors don't do you any good, okay? Besides, that steam is about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So anybody who's in there is parboiled, plus it uses up all the oxygen instantly. Kind of a nasty way to go, but it's get some of these underground targets we can't get with conventional munition, or even nukes. This is what Nevada test site looks like. If you haven't been out there, every one of those is a collapse crater, the result of doing an underground nuclear test. We did them two ways, shaft and a tunnel. They were mostly done in vertical shafts for high yield and weapons development stuff. We did up to 1.3 megatons at the test site. In addition, the objectives were, again, design, reliability, safety. They could be very simple, which they were in the 60s, to extremely complex, which was one we still show off to people called IceCap, which was to be a joint Los Alamos, United Kingdom test, okay? And incidentally, because we didn't do that test, England got out of the gravity bomb business. And so they're only in the Trident business now, okay, with their 4 submarines. Basically, you had to build an underground laboratory and a vertical shaft. Drilling out there was unique. Biggest drill rigs in the world. Now, this blind shaft drilling is used all over the world in mining applications. One of the areas that's going to be big in a few years is oil mining, where you'll put down one of these 8 or 12-foot holes, and diameter holes are even larger, and then with micro tunnel boring machines, bore drifts off of these holes and let the oil flow into them and then pump it out. And then you can do a carbon dioxide flood and all sorts of things. It's kind of interesting. There's one of those bits. That's 250,000 pounds of weight on top of that bit. We could drill a 2,000-foot hole out there and not be more than 1 foot out of plumb. In fact, if you go to the IceCap one, it was drilled I think 1,635 feet, and it's 1 inch out of perfect plumb. You don't build skyscrapers that straight, okay? There's what they look like. There's one going down hole. That happened to be that 1.3 megaton shot. It was a Livermore device development test. This is Los Alamos, and it's you can see all the cables strung out there that'll all go down hole. And that's what it kind of looked like for most of these. And you had to stem the hole back up, put sand and gravel down it. You had to ship devices out there, and for, in the early days, they flew the devices out of Los Alamos here, and they landed out on Yucca Lake, and then somebody thought, gee, what happens if the airplane crashes? Because some of these things are not 1-point safe. So, you might have a few tons of yield and a lot of dispersal of material. So then they stopped flying them, and so then they would truck them. And then they said, well, gee, what happens if somebody steals the truck? So then they started shipping them out in pieces. Okay, and then they started shipping them out in SSTs, Safe Secure Transportators, which are these special vehicles that were built by Sandia for DOE. And they get them out there. We had our own out there. It was this truck over here. I love this one. They put so much Kevlar and stuff to keep somebody from shooting a bullet into it that when they had it sitting there, it would just go up in the air like this. So they had to put a lot of ballast up in the front to counterweight that thing. And they'd move it around. And the gadgets in the box there. And there were ways of emplacing it. Los Alamos did it the most simple. Livermore, of course, would have to do it the most complex way. And I'm not joking. I mean, I could say that and it's not because I'm in a Los Alamos audience, but I was DNA, and sometimes we were the translators between the two labs, okay? We carried the message back and forth. And, but the one I love over here is this peaceful nuclear explosion shot. The bomb's right there, 8 inches in diameter, and Rolson. It was a 40 kiloton shot. You notice the two-man rule in effect there? Actually, it was the photographer. Anyway, going down hole and filling it up, recording. Inside were all these sweep oscilloscopes to record. A lot of you probably spent hours balancing those things and things like that, electrically balancing them. And then modern today and digital looks like that. A lot easier to do. And, fired them all from a test controller's room. I tried to find a Los Alamos picture, but I couldn't. The only one I had is this one of a Livermore test. There's Larry Federber, if anybody remembers Larry. And Jim Magruder sitting next to him. And fired from the control room. And now that's been replaced and totally refurbished. But that's where it would be. And firing would be from that little suitcase. And that was it. And I'll stop here. Take questions. Yes, sir.
Could you expand a bit on the stockroom confidence test? You showed two.
Okay.
Were there very many? You said there weren't very many.
No, one was the first one was really Crossroads able. Okay, I mean that was right out of the stockpile. That was a Mark III just taken right out of the stockpile. We didn't have very many in the stockpile in 1946. I think we had 5. And so it was, the first. Next one that comes along is Grable, which was the atomic cannon, which there was some pictures in there, the 280 millimeter shell. Now the Army wanted to do that just as if it was a real thing. Have their crew go put the shell in and slam it in the breech, and the guy pull the lanyard, and fire it. And while they were having a safety meeting a couple weeks before, one of the Los Alamos people asked, what's the chance of that sticking in the breech? And the Army guy said, oh, it's about 1 in 10,000. And the guy says, well, if that happens, you got 15 kilotons. There's no safety features on that, okay, that will stop it from assembling. It's a gun-assembled weapon. And So anyway, the Army guys said, well, gee, maybe we ought to fire it remotely. So we have pictures of this. EG&G guys built a little shelf with a solenoid, and they put a 25-pound lead brick tied to the lanyard. And so the signal went, collapsed the shelf, and the brick pulled the lanyard and fired the cannon.
And it didn't stick.
Didn't stick. It went 33,000 feet downrange to the target. And they only missed the target by 540 feet, which is pretty doggone good when you think about it. And, because remember, we're dealing with nukes, not horseshoes. So, you know. We learned a lot about Grable because it went only 500 feet off the ground. And that's where we first started to understand a phenomena called non-ideal air blast, or precursors, which is very important for targets that are above ground, that are drag sensitive. So after that, let's see, we did the wigwam test off of San Diego, which was a nuclear depth charge. Actually had 3 submarines submerged on cables beneath barges, and looked at effects on that. And that was a full-up gadget. It wasn't airdropped. It was so the firing set was a little bit modified. Then the 2 I talked about, we did a few others. The problem is, when you went underground, you always had to modify the fire set. Okay, you couldn't fire it with the radar fuse, or you couldn't fire it with a proximity fuse, or you couldn't fire it with an altimeter fuse. So you had to fire it, you know, so you had to make a modification. The last major one we did was called Stilton Hushed Echo, which was a shot with Livermore on a device that sits on Minuteman. And we went up to Minot, if I remember correctly, and we randomly chose one and opened up the silo and took 2, and took them out to Nevada and randomly chose one of the 2 and tested it. And let me tell you, I thought the 4-star from SAC was going to, you know, have a cow literally as it got closer and closer. That guy, you know, got about as white as your shirt, about 15 seconds. It used to be amazing in the control room, in the war room. About 30 seconds before one of these would go off, it'd get deathly silent. And when we did our last underground effects test, which was called Hunter's Trophy, September 1992, we fired that while the Senate was voting on the Hatfield Amendment. Okay? Leaders of the Senate said, go ahead and do it. And we told them it cost $300,000 a day to stand down. And that was the truth. And so they wouldn't be offended by doing it. And about 15 seconds before shot time, the only phone that rang in that room rang. Okay? And Nick Aquilina, who was the manager out there, said, don't answer it. Okay? Turned out to be a wrong number. So we fired the shot. Anything else?
Byron, first, thanks for a great talk. Really appreciate it. I'm going to need that Des Moines video. That's going to be shown again, first of all. Second of all, you mentioned your favorite Edward Teller story. I'd like to hear it.
Steve will get a big kick out of this. We asked both labs to consider a new device for our effects test. We didn't get into the effects test. But, you know, we wanted the radiative output of a megaton type device, okay, out of something that's a couple kilotons or 10 kilotons. And so, just so the ground shock, you know, doesn't destroy the experiments. That's a real trick to design a nuclear device that can give you what we call really hot X-rays out of very low yield. And so Livermore took on the challenge of designing a new one for us. And we had this big design meeting out in Livermore, 2 days, A and B division both present, and a lot of names I know Steve would recognize that were in the room. But the lead was up at the blackboard, and he was putting down all the action items. Who was going to do this calculation and this calculation and ta-da-da-da. And Edward stopped, and he sticks his head in the door, and he stands there for a while, leaning on his walking stick and rubbing his chin a little bit. And he finally says, "You know, Patrick, I don't think that's going to work." And Pat put the chalk down, shows you how long ago it was, turned around and said, "That's okay, Edward, your first three didn't work either." Which was true. And I'm sitting over in the corner, never had met Edward, and I'm thinking God was just insulted here, you know. And I go out to Pat, and Edward says, "All right, Patrick, that's why we test." And that really hit home. And that's why we do test, to make sure they will work. And so I went up to Pat after the meeting. I said, "You're a little harsh on Edward." He says, "Why? He puts his pants on the same way I do." And he said, "Have you ever met Edward?" And I said, "No." And he takes me down the hall to Edward's big office. And I sat out with Edward for about 20 minutes. And Edward said, and told him all about cratering and ground shock stuff we were doing out at Anahuac. And he said, "Oh, I know all about that. You know, you're on the right track, but you're going to have to prove to these guys that the craters really are big because of other reasons, not from the energy coupling." And I said, "Yeah." And he says, "Well, when you come by here to Livermore, you stop and see me if I'm here." And so I did almost every time after that. And there was two Edward Tellers, let me tell you. There was Edward Teller, who was a scientist, calm, absolutely brilliant, fun to talk to. And then you put him in front of a TV camera or a committee, and it was like Jekyll and Hyde, okay? It's the only way to describe it. I'm glad I knew him. Yes, sir.
Byron, could you talk about a couple of the oopses like Mighty Oak and Mighty Smith?
Okay. First off, Mighty Oak was a containment failure not on my watch. And the only reason it wasn't on my watch is because I quit the agency in part over that. And before it happened, it's incidentally how I got my nickname at the test site, called Karnak, you know. I knew it was going to happen. And it didn't get out of the tunnel, okay? It was controlled inside the tunnel, but it took out $40 million worth of equipment almost instantaneously within the first 50 seconds. And contaminated T-tunnel to the point that we never really used T-tunnel again. And so it was, I think I had to testify 3 times in front of congressional committees about it and other things like that. We changed our designs after that to what I wanted to, and I came back to the agency as a result of that. So, yeah, Mighty Smith, we had and Dr. Kunkel over here was one of the lead investigators on the OT committee, and that was an unfortunate kind of industrial accident. That was one of the shallowest scale depths of burial we ever did in the tunnels. Normally the tunnel shots are so deeply buried they don't have a surface expression. You don't have a collapse crater. They just chimney part of the way up when they collapse into the cavity. And on that one, we were at a scale depth of burial such that we were sort of in a gray zone where you might have collapse, and it turned out we did. And formed a crater about 130 feet in diameter and about 10 feet deep. And 10 people or 13 people got injured. One person died of complications from having a broken pelvis, being in the hospital, got pneumonia, infection, and died from that. Bill Smith, he was an electrician, knew him fairly well out there. Nice guy. But he had all sorts of other problems. His emphysema didn't help and things like that. But it was an unfortunate thing. We sure changed procedures after that. Now, those are the two, that stand out, and, they were a concern. And I'm the guy who said collapse was unlikely, but I said we were at the very shallow, scale depth of burial, and we should be prepared. Now, I had left the agency not too long before that occurred,
And I think if I had been at the agency, I would have said we don't send a team up until we have cavity collapse. Because I used to make that call. Instead, my boss out there, Joe Lacombe, made the decision, and along with Jim Magruder, to go ahead and send people up on the Mesa, because for a Los Alamos experiment, okay, Milagro, which was attached to Midas Smith, and and there was, get back and get your photographic records off your, sweep oscilloscopes and stuff. So that's, just one of those unfortunate things that happened. And well, like I say, we never did that again. Because we used to think, yeah, if you're on the surface, you're going to see a couple G's acceleration, but it's going to scare the living you-know-what out of you. But at the same time, it's not going to result in any injuries or stuff. And we used to watch the geophones if we had a team up there. Nobody was watching the geophones to say, hey, cavity collapse is going to happen. Get the heck away from ground zero area. So we sure watched the geophones after that. So, any other questions?
One more question, and then I think Byron.
Steve, you had a question, I think. Oh, okay. Yes, sir.
Do you have any sort of comparable war stories from the Soviets that
Let me tell
you'd be
you,
willing
one
to
of
share?
the funniest ones told to me, and this was told by a cousin of Mikhail Gorbachev, who's an Artemis 16 guy, the Veniev today. Anyway, they were doing a shot, and this was fairly early in their program. And in fact, Alex Chernyshев, who became a close friend of ours, was involved. And it was an effects test. And they had an experimental room underground. And they had warheads and stuff in the room. And they were exposing them to the radiation. And they buttoned up their tunnel, closed all their doors and everything, and they got out. And Viktor Mikhailov, who was the test director, had poured everybody about yay a vodka to toast to the success of the test. And everybody picked up their glasses and started to toast, and Mikhailov notices there's 2 glasses that haven't been picked up. So he starts counting noses, and he realizes they're missing 2 guys. So they must be inside the tunnel. So they went back into the to the tunnel, and they had a TV camera, not very good one, as they said, and they could see 2 shapes. And one looked like he was down kneeling in the corner. And there was a lot of debate whether to go back and get him, because one of the guys was a KGB observer, and nobody liked him. I don't make this up, folks. Anyway, it's selling. Well, this being told, the Russians are just roaring and laughing at the story. But the other guy was a good guy, so they went in and got him. And they thought the guy that was down on his knees was praying. Okay, it turned out to be the KGB guy, and he was trying to chew the firing cables off with his teeth. So they buttoned it all up. They get out. Somehow, another bottle of vodka appeared. They all had their toast again, and then they drive back, and the general is just absolutely furious. Where have you been? And why are you so late? And why didn't you say anything? And Mikhailov looks at the general and says, oh, just some technical difficulties. So, yeah, they had their experiences the same way. And it's a lot of fun working out there side by side with especially some of the older guys who are my age, who actually worked on the underground tests, and would tell you a lot of the same kinds of problems we kind of had, and problems with vacuum systems, problems with their portable generators going down at the wrong time, and usually when ground shock hit them, okay, and things like that. So a lot of comparable stories, yeah. And of course, they had a lot of containment failures at Diglin Mountain. So when you go there, you know which ones were containment failures instantly, because your Geiger counter goes crazy. So, you know, they're safe levels, but they're quite elevated relative to background, 5 to 10 times background.
Well, let's all thank Byron again. Thank you.
Thank you.